welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. Hope you're having yourself a great day. It is already the middle of Wednesday, the middle of the week. This week is another week that is just humming by. We got a really important topic today. Now, you have heard about herbicide resistance, but what about fungicide resistance? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to learn a lot from today's guest. We'd love some questions from you. If you want to participate in today's discussion, all you have to do is enter your question, your comment in the Q&A box or the whatever, if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Put it in there, and I will get to as many of the questions as I possibly can. But I got a whole bunch of my own that we're going to get to. Let's bring in today's guest right now. It is Colleen Redlick with BASF. Hey, Colleen, how are you?
I'm good, Shaun. How are you?
Hey, doing fantastic. So you and I earlier today, along with a couple other members of our gang, we did a whole webinar on fungicide resistance. We had like over, 600 growers. It was awesome. There was real interest in this topic of fungicide resistance. I guess let's start from square one. Why should I be thinking or concerned about fungicide resistance?
Yeah, so I think that's, a great question. And that was really the motivation behind doing this webinar. So we're glad to see such great engagement. Like you said, herbicide resistance is something that we've really, unfortunately, had a lot of experience with lately in Western Canada. And we're feeling like growers are getting a good understanding of this. But when it comes to fungicide resistance, we are really seeing a bit of a gap where people maybe just weren't as aware. So as far as why we should care, I think it's because really we are seeing fungicides sprayed on more acres across Western Canada. We've seen that trend of increasing fungicide use certainly over the last 10 years. So as we're applying more of these fungicides, we need to think about how this is impacting our resistance risk. We've had limited number of cases in Western Canada, and that's really the great news story because we have the opportunity to go at this really a lot more proactively than we did with herbicide resistance. But, we are seeing a few things starting to pop up, certainly in our pulse crops. Chickpea growers are probably really familiar with this. So we're seeing that, where growers are relying more on fungicides to produce these high yielding crops, we are seeing resistance issues starting to crop up. So I think that's why now is the time we really need to start talking about this, increase the knowledge that's out there with our growers and our agronomists and get ahead of it.
Now, I had mentioned this morning on the webinar that, like I get in a fruit and vegetable situation where they're spraying fungicides, every couple days, multiple times through the growing season to try to stay ahead of some of those diseases. In the case of Western Canada or even Ontario, we're spraying a fungicide once. Can we still develop resistance?
Yeah, so I think, any time we're spraying a fungicide, we are going to be applying that selection pressure. So there is, a risk of resistance there. Certainly to your point, where it's once per season, obviously that's an agronomic practice that's going to be decreasing that risk. But, anytime we're applying that selection pressure with a pesticide, whether it's a herbicide, whether it's a fungicide, we have to understand that we are, selecting for those resistant individuals in the population. So certainly one way to lower the risk is to minimize those applications, but the risk is there. And certainly in crops like, fruit and veg, but even like pulse crops on the prairies where we're starting to see multiple applications in a season becoming more common, we need to be aware of this.
So how is it similar to some of the best management practices when it comes to herbicide resistance?
Yeah, so I think, that's the great news story probably is we've learned a lot from herbicide resistance, and a lot of those best management practices we can kind of apply across both. So, certain things that we talk about with fungicide resistance, things like varietal selection. So, with herbicide resistance, it might be more just planting a more competitive variety. Sometimes there's things to do with height, just with things that close canopies faster. With fungicides, it might be looking more at the disease resistant package. But certainly like some of these similarities, things that start right at the very start of the season. Fertilizing with herbicide or fungicide resistance, you want to grow a healthy crop. You want to make sure it's robust to some of these stresses that are going to happen later in the season. But you also have that delicate balance of not wanting to create lodging, not wanting to create a microclimate for the disease to develop. things like target plant population seeding. So important to have that competitive plant population when you're looking at competing against weeds early in the season, but also when you're looking at, that balance of having a healthy, good stand of a crop, but not creating, an overcrowding situation that can cause that microclimate for fungicides. And probably one of the biggest ones that we talk about with both is just when it comes down to how we're going to manage and apply those products. So looking at using multiple modes of action in the tank, tank mixing products, and alternating when tank mixes aren't possible. So a lot of those IPM practices, I think people sometimes get sick of hearing about them from all of us all the time, but it really is something we have to keep the focus on, because I think, we're not going to spray ourselves out of herbicide resistance, and we're not going to spray ourselves out of fungicide resistance either, but we might be able to spray ourselves into it. So we need to look at these fungicides as really a piece of the puzzle with all those IPM practices that are going to really increase our ability to grow sustainable crops and use fungicides in a sustainable way for a long period of time.
So how is fungicide resistance different than herbicide resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the key things, like I always come at it, I am a weed scientist, I'm not a pathologist, so come at it from that angle as well. And one of the biggest things that we see is just that, with herbicide resistance, you're talking about weed populations, you're talking about persistent seed banks. When you get something like wild oats and you're concerned about selecting for herbicide resistance, really growers, agronomists have to be aware that that's going to be coming up every year, and you're going to likely be spraying and applying that selection pressure every year. With fungicides, one really key difference is that you do need a host, right? So we have the disease triangle, the environment, the pathogen, and that host is a key piece. So if you're using a good crop rotation and controlling your volunteers, it's possible that you're not applying that same selection pressure every year, right? So, switching from, say, canola to a wheat crop, if you're concerned about resistance developing in sclerotinia and canola, well, your wheat crop's not going to be a host. So we have that unique opportunity with fungicide resistance to do some other things with management.
Yeah, I should have brought this up earlier. You're a weed scientist. What are you doing talking about fungicides? How'd you get drug into stuff like this?
Well, BASF, I guess, they're a great company that they encourage you to learn new things. So I'm taking a mat leave for one of my colleagues as the fungicide specialist, and I'm learning as I go. But I'll say a lot of what I've learned, I think, is pretty practical, because I was also a tech service specialist for the last 5 years. So going out, boots on the ground, walking fields with growers and agronomists, and I think that's really, how I've learned a lot about fungicide management and how we're talking about resistance issues as well.
Okay, so Lindsay's watching on Facebook, and she has a question that I actually asked this morning on the webinar. It has to do with what about like the half rate of tilt idea that a lot of growers were doing? Is that a bad idea?
Yeah, so I think we talked about that a little bit on the webinar, and I was glad to have Kelly Turkington's support on this one. So, BASF is part of FRAC, the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, and it's one of the really key tenets that FRAC has, that we don't want to, cut rates. We want to make sure that we're applying our fungicides at the recommended label rates. The other thing with tilt is, that is a group 3 product. Those are probably some of the worst ones to start cutting to half rates, because that's where, that selection pressure not going to be good. And just with the type of resistance that those group 3s develop, not a good idea. I think the other thing, coming at this, even so from a resistance standpoint, not a good idea. Really, we had Kelly Turkington on the call, and him and his colleagues have done a lot of work showing that this isn't a great time for ROI either, right? So, we want to talk about using our fungicides judiciously, managing them in ways that they're not going to cause undue selection pressure, but growers are going to get a return. And really what Kelly's work has shown is that this isn't, the optimal timing to be applying that fungicide anyway.
Yeah, same thing with cutting rates in herbicides. You have a less of a deadly dose, or you more are going to survive, and that's how you build up the resistance, which is actually what you're trying to avoid. So yeah,
exactly.
the old half rate of tilt. I like how that's like a thing that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about when we mention that. So are some fungicides more likely to develop resistance versus other ones?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and a really good point that on the webinar this morning we talked about, and there is a lot of confusion about this and about those fungicide groups. So yes, there definitely are fungicides that are more likely to build up resistance and higher risk. And a great resource for this is FRAC again, so frac.info. They've characterized these fungicides that we use, and some of the key ones, basically our fungicides we're relying here in Western Canada mostly on group 3, 7s, and 11s. The group 11s are going to be the highest risk for resistance. Doesn't make them bad products. They're great products in a lot of ways. Work very well when everything is susceptible, but they do carry with them that higher risk for resistance. The group 7s, SDHIs, are also considered, medium to medium high for resistance, so a little bit less concerned than the 11s, but still have to be aware. And the group 3s are also medium risk, so they're probably the lowest. But I think, one of the things we've really talked about and tried to hit home with growers and agronomists is look on the label, look on the case, keep track of what you're applying. Those high-risk fungicides, the group 11s especially, we want to protect them and make sure that they're useful for a longer period of time. So when you have those higher risk products, mixing them with the other modes of action, making a multiple mode of action product on the pathogen you're targeting is a great way to manage those higher risk fungicides.
Is there any best management practices out there? So if group 11 is what I'm trying to preserve, I only use that when I know pressure will be really, really high. I'm going to get the biggest bang. Like that's when I'm going to save that group 11 for that situation, or I use it only every 4 years. Like is there some like rules of thumb to live by on how I manage that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great, FRAC and BASF have provided some great info on managing group 11s, because certainly we want to preserve those ones because they are very valuable. And I think one of the key things is one application per year. So, we talked about with crop rotation, you maybe don't have to worry about, a group 11 in pulses and then coming back with one in cereals because your target pathogens are going to be different. But certainly one thing that we saw in pulses was, multiple applications of a group 11 product in a year. That's really something we want to avoid. So making sure you're limiting that application to one. And, to your point, Shaun, applying it where it has the best chance of being, really, really impactful. So with something like peas and lentils, the first pass is a great time for that group 11. Really is going to come in, control those key early season diseases that growers are more worried about, I guess, and can cause more yield loss. And then if you do need a second application, make sure you are not using a product containing a group 11. So once again, check the label, check the guide to crop protection, because a lot of them are mixtures, and make sure you're going in with a different mode of action for your second pass.
And did one of the other gentlemen, we mentioned Kelly Turkington was on the webinar with us this morning, but also Dwayne Rathman, and he is with BASF out of Minnesota, and he was sharing some of his experiences with sugar beets and fungicide resistance. I think I heard him say in his list of things to do, even rotate inside the groups. So it's just not about like this year I use an 11, next year I use a different group. It's also about rotation inside those groups and keeping track of that. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, so Dwayne was, it's a bit of a specific example. So he was talking about the group 3s, because group 3s are sort of what they have left for sugar beets. In addition to the multi-sites, they're in a bit of a state down there. Group 3s, there is more of a differential tolerance among that group, versus with group 11s, we have a phenomenon what's called cross resistance. So what that means essentially is that when we see resistance develop to a group 11 fungicide, it's a very complete type of resistance, and it's typically what we see is going to be impactful against all group 11 fungicides commercially available right now. So with the group 3s, I think that's more important to rotate within season. With the group 11s, it's a lot more about just limiting to one application per season, and that's what's really supported by FRAC.
Okay, good stuff. What else was I going to ask you from my notes here? Well, I'll get to this. Okay, this came up several times. Okay, I'm confused, and I'm always confused, but some of the agronomists were confused too. You're telling me that I need to be proactive and taking care of disease, but you're also telling me that I need to be like overuse is going to lead to fungicide resistance, or could. I'm confused on like that seems like a really narrow band there, like of gray area. What are you actually telling me to do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mentioned on the webinar, even our sales reps, when I'm training new sales rep, that very often comes up is, well, which is it? Like we're very key to talk about preventative application, not letting the spore load build up. Fungicides don't have those eradicative properties. So when you see disease, you're not going to be able to get rid of the symptomology that's there. So we want to make sure we're applying preventatively. But I think, one of the key distinctions and probably why there is some confusion in the industry is, it gets a little bit confused. We still want people out scouting, right? Like, we're selling fungicides. I'll be honest, I can come and talk till I'm blue in the face. The absolute best sales pitch for us is when a farmer talks to another farmer and says, I use that BASF product and dang if it didn't work great, right? So that's what we want to do. We want to set growers up for success, that they're out scouting, making sure that the conditions in their field, the crop condition, it's a crop that is showing good yield potential, checking that weather forecast, that, there's potential for disease to build up or, develop in the field. And then you make the decision to deploy a fungicide. So that's more what we're getting at, I guess, is, spray preventatively, but you still need to be out scouting for crop condition and only using fungicides where they're warranted. So spraying a fungicide on a very thin crop in a very dry year where you weren't likely to see development of disease, and you're not likely to get an ROI if you're leaving those check strips, which I know everyone is leaving in their fields, right, to check their efficacy. That's kind of the key distinction for me, is spray preventatively, but make sure that the spray is, do your best to make sure it's warranted.
Preventatively means getting out of the truck and scouting. And you mentioned the word scouting, and that is absolutely critical here. Don't be the 100-kilometer-an-hour drive-by agronomist, and I might as well spray because I know I'm going to have to spray. I know it. I don't even have to look. Don't do that. In the case of herbicide resistance, for that reason, and fungicide, right?
Oh, exactly. I think scouting is such a key piece, and it's, like you said, one of the easiest ones that that comment's hilarious. It just came in on Facebook. That gets brought up a lot. Once again, you want to be scouting before you apply. Make sure that you're, selecting the right product, using a product when warranted, targeting the right pest, and I mentioned on the webinar, I'm really terrible at this one. I'm not so bad for the 100-kilometer-an-hour scouting, but I'm terrible for the follow-up scouting from the swather or the combine and going, geez, I don't know if I got good control of that. And, as someone who now works for a chem company, that makes it really hard for us to help, right? For us to do that follow-up. So I think, you want to be scouting early. You want to make sure you're applying the right product to the right field situation, right time, right rate. And then you also want to go back and make sure that you got good efficacy. And particularly as we're talking about, resistance, it's very important, if you have one of those higher risk pathogens, to be out there looking at how things are performing in your field.
Yeah. Brian, we're talking about scouting. Brian Voth, watching on Facebook, says, never mind the drive-by scouting. I had a farmer once tell me every farmer should have an airplane and be going over every field every week during the summer. Yeah, that's about the same thing. Okay, hold on here. I got a question from Lindsay on Facebook. How important is water volume, the right nozzles, etc. in this discussion?
Super important. Lindsay's like my favorite person right now. That's such a great lead into what we talk about. So, I think this is one that we see a lot, really, when we have inquiries. We do sometimes have product efficacy inquiries. They're not that often related to resistance. They're a lot more related to, what Lindsay has astutely pointed out here. So, fungicides are always registered at 10 gallons per acre. I really like to highlight to growers, that's a minimum water volume. If you're trying to penetrate a really thick canopy, you've got a really good crop going, more water is probably the easiest thing you can add to the tank. We get asked that a lot, is there anything I can add as far as these tank additives or agents, and I'm like, just add more water. Like, that's probably the cheapest and easiest thing. And they say that, well, because you're not driving the water truck, Colleen. That's a fair point. But I think these are really key for fungicide efficacy, is getting that coverage. The right nozzles, absolutely. I'm not going to pretend to be a nozzle expert, but I think you've probably had Tom Wolfe on the show enough that people know who to go to for that information. All this is really critical. And, fungicides mostly are going to be moving out and up in the plant. So you really need to get that penetration to where you need them to be active. So absolutely, application is a huge piece of fungicide efficacy, and getting great efficacy, like you said, going to reduce that population of pathogens in the crop and lower your resistance risk as well.
Okay, another question for you. Does application rate and improper timing of the fungicide lead to developing resistance quicker than if by following the label suggestions?
Yeah, so we hit on that a bit already. I think, with frac, that's going to be a really key point that BASF is going to be hammering home, is that really you do need to follow that labeled rate. We don't want to see cut rates or split rates sometimes with those half rates that herbicide timing coming back in later. We also heard Kelly Turkington talk about it a little bit. You don't want to increase that rate either over what's on the label, right? So making sure that you are following the label, because that can have kind of other impacts as well. We don't want increased doses used either. So yeah, absolutely make sure you're using the right rate and timing for sure. I mean, not only is it going to impact efficacy, but really if you're going too early and not really getting good efficacy on that disease, you're probably going to need another application, right, to really control it. So we want to make sure the fungicides are being deployed when they have the best chance at reducing that population, and they're not just creating an undue selection pressure.
A lot of work goes into establishing that rate that's on the label. It's like,
Yes.
it's just not sort of like, some work goes into it. Lara has a comment here. I think there's been some crossover on that line between preventative spraying and using prediction maps, paying attention to thresholds, and spraying just cause. Yeah, we didn't mention the prediction maps on stuff too. That probably plays a role in people's thinking, I have to go, apply this product because the map told me so. We still need to follow that up with our eyes and make sure.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And that's another very smart lady from Bigger, Saskatchewan, I think. So happy to see Lara joining in on the call. But, those prediction maps are great. But I think to that point, they're predictions. They tell you where you need to get off your butt and go do more scouting, and, where maybe you can be a little bit less concerned. Things like the FHB maps that have been coming out and being more and more useful to growers. But for sure, great point. The just because spraying is not what we want to encourage.
Yeah, and you mentioned pulses. Is there other crops that where there's really people need to be kind of really thinking about this proactively, besides the pulses?
Yeah, I think pulses and fruit and veg obviously are where we've kind of seen most of the issues in Canada. We've been pretty lucky in our cereals and canola crops that we haven't really seen this yet. I would say pulses for my region that I worked in was certainly the focus, and that's where probably we want to continue to focus on. But we absolutely can't rest on our laurels when it comes to cereals and canola as well. These are best practices, and best practices should be applied across all our crops and our entire farm.
Yeah, well, and it was really, really good this morning to have some of that U.S. sugar beet as the case study, right? And I said, when it comes to resistance, it seems like information flows north, because when herbicide resistance, we started talking about that a lot. There a lot of companies like BASF where here's a farmer from Kentucky and here's what they're dealing with, right? And so it's sort of a similar thing. But we need to learn from some of these other areas. And just because we don't have it here yet doesn't mean we can just put our head in the sand and like an ostrich and ignore it. We need to learn from some of these other areas that have gone through these experiences, so we don't lose the usability of some of these products that are just so valuable to us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was awesome to have Dwayne on the call. We were kind of prepping him before and saying, we think you're going to be great for this, and try to share and not scare, right? Because I think when you get people hearing about six apps of fungicide being down to group 3s and having to rotate group 3s, it can be a little scary. But it's important that we know this, and great to hear from those colleagues and share their experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if you can leave us with anything, Colleen, what are some things that growers need to really, in terms of the best management practices, to manage and be preventative when it comes to fungicide resistance? Let's recircle back there. What are the things they need to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I think they really need to keep in mind that, the whole triangle that we talked about, right? You have the pathogen that's going to impact it. We have the chemistry, the fungicide that's going to that's going to impact risk. And then we have our agronomics. And I think, we need to understand the pathogen. We need to understand the chemistry. And that's where there's maybe been a bit of a gap. So, that frac.info site, great place to look up the risk of your pathogen and of your fungicide. Understand those groups. We talked about that. That's so critical. Understand which ones are higher risk and deploy those with caution. And then your agronomics. I think, we can't hammer on that enough, and encourage everybody to check out Kelly Turkington's stuff, because he is, like we said this morning, wrote the book on this type of stuff. But that's really where we can influence change, where we can make sure we don't get in this situation like with herbicides, is by adjusting our agronomic practices, using multiple modes of action. Crop rotation is a big one. And you already talked about a bit, Shaun, but scouting, not scouting from the truck or the combine, getting out there, getting an idea of what's going on in your fields. Talk to your BASF rep if you need help with that. We've got a ton of boots on the ground that are happy to provide help.
We also learned from Brian, don't scout from an airplane as well. We've been talking today on RealAg Live with Colleen Redlick from BASF. Colleen, thank you so much for joining us here today on RealAg Live. Oh, I think we just lost her.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Okay, good. Hey, I want to encourage everybody to check out RealAg Radio on Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM. Got a great show today. We're going to talk about rural health. How has the vaccine rollout for COVID-19 gone differently in rural centers than our urban brethren? We're going to learn all about that today from actually the head of the Society of Rural Physicians of Canada. So thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live. Chat again tomorrow.